So this is why I want people to scan your body.
Yeah.
Because you might feel it from your heart, but who knows where else you happen to feel courage? I didn't know I'd find a happy warrior 2 inches above my knees. I don't even understand what that's about. Welcome, everybody, to the Simply Human YouTube channel and podcast. I'm Christina Caro, clinical psychologist.
And I'm Lynskey, a leadership and self-trust coach.
So it is February 2025 at the time of this recording, and there's a lot of people who are feeling scared in this country right now, probably across the world, since actions in this country affect people everywhere. So we thought this would be really a right time to tackle the foundational qualities of courage, because our times today are really calling for us to dig deep and find that courage within ourselves. It is a big concept, courage, and we are going to break it down over several episodes on different facets of courage. So today we'll explore courage in interpersonal relationships. Before we start, if you haven't yet, remember to hit the subscribe button. We're at the end of our first year on YouTube and podcast platforms, and we want to thank everyone who has subscribed to the channel and supported us and sent in your comments and your questions. We really appreciate it. And we would really love to hear what topics you would like us to cover. And you can either do that by putting a comment below, or you can email us at simplyhuman.connect@gmail.com. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting about this, because the last one we did was on uncertainty. And part of it is acting in courage right now in this time of uncertainty too. And so I'm glad we're focusing on this. And another reason why I'm excited about discussing this topic is because it's critical to us living, not just surviving through a time, right?
Yeah.
It's critical for me when I think about courage. It's a way for me not to become a victim to circumstances, that I have to be courageous in each and every decision I make and how I live. It's very simple. Talk more about this as I share later on the podcast, but I used to make courageous just a big thing. So that's why I think it's so exciting for me is, remember, I have little acts of courage that just took as much courage than the big acts of courage, but I didn't want to call it courage because it seemed so minor. When we're talking about the term courage or having courage, how would you describe that to them?
Yeah, that's a really good point about what you said in terms of people. I'm surprised by this, but people will say, "Oh, I'm not courageous."
Yeah, that was me at
And
one time.
yeah, and I love what you said, recognizing, wait a minute, I do lots of little acts of courage. So let's get clear about what we're talking about. And this is a distinction that I often make with my clients. The word comes from the Latin word for heart, core. So I like to define the word courage is to act from the heart in face of fear. So the difference that I see happen a lot when people self-identify and they say, "Oh, I don't think I'm really very courageous." What I find is what they mean is they don't see themselves as fearless, especially in a community where I live, where we're out in the wilderness and people are always going into the backcountry and they're doing big days in the mountains and scary things and rock climbing and all of this, that there is a bit of ethos around fearlessness. There's a difference between fearlessness and courage. Fearlessness is the absence of fear. To be fearless, I don't have fear. So if you're fearless, well, you just go, yeah, I'm going to ski down that black diamond or I'm going to climb up that wall, because I'm not afraid to do it. That's not the same as courage. Courage is to be in your heart and to still act in the face of fear. So courage actually acknowledges that we have fear, and then it's the ability to take action in spite of that fear. Does that make sense to you, Karen?
Yeah, and when you brought that distinction to me, I think it made it easier for me to distinguish what I considered courageous, because I would have went where you went before. And so that's very interesting how you distinguished it, because it's still stepping out.
You can be
Mhm.
reckless. I don't have fear of this thing and I just go for it. And sometimes
It
you
works and sometimes it
see,
doesn't. It doesn't.
and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
But when you have courage, that means you acknowledge that something scary is in front of you. And I wanted to share some quotes
Oh,
to
cool.
people throughout history who have captured this. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he had a quote, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than the fear." I
Love
love that one.
something is more important. That's true. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
John Wayne, he was quoted as saying, "Courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway."
Because in the US, he's known for the Western, so that's what he would.
He
Yeah.
was a cowboy. He was a movie star. But I love it. Courage is being scared to death. And then the great Maya Angelou, "Courage is the most important of all virtues because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently."
Mm.
So if you're going to practice honesty consistently, there are times where being honest will have high stakes. So you have to have courage to do it. If you're going to be generous or compassionate, there will be situations where, say, you are walking on the street and you see someone being bullied, and normally your compassion would be to want to help, but like, oh, I don't want to get hurt in it, right? You're in that moment of fear. And so you have to have courage to act on all of these other virtues. And then finally, our favorite shame researcher, Brene Brown, in her research, which she identified is for the most part, circumstances that demand courage, you will always find these three factors: uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Any situation that has those three factors, it requires us to step up with courage, because all of those things, we just did an episode on sitting with uncertainty, and we talked about how much stress and anxiety and how it's hardwired in our brain that uncertainty means you not be able to find food in the watering hole and die. So certainty equals my survival. The ability to take a risk, which is high stakes. Will I be successful? Will I be shunned? Will I be humiliated? And then emotional exposure. Am I willing to put my heart out there and face possible rejection or consequences? So all of those situations require us to have heart in the face of fear.
It's interesting though, because when I think about courage myself, I had to realize it's recognizing that I do have doubts. I have fears. I feel like I know my fears come up because I feel this tenseness always in my shoulders. So I finally figured out where my feel existed, which is a lot in my shoulders. I cave in about it. I feel like that tenseness. And to know too that those doubts and fears, those are just like those warning triggers, like that lizard brain, monkey brain, whatever you want to call it, the old brain that is like warning, warning, but it's not to stop you. It's just to give you that warning. And then you just got to decide the why. Is it bigger? Like why you're doing it, it makes you want to really do it. And you got to trust yourself. One of the things I spoke about was recognizing the small elements or small events of courage that I did have. And the one that I remember was the first time I went off the high dive. And I remember as I was going up, my heart was racing. I remember even shaking my head. I remember what am I doing? Oh my God, what if I like miss the water? And it's impossible to miss the water, but my brain was like going, and all over the place. But I remember then once I got to the top, I kind of like just ran because I just had to go for it because I was worried that my fear would never let me do it. And then when I did it and I ran in the water, I'm like so proud of myself. And I just realized, oh my gosh. And then I started to understand that, wow, it's like courage makes you proud when you do it right. Right. And I think it was really, really cool about it because I had that like, oh my God, this is so cool. And then that courageous effort just went out of my brain because it was just like, it's just so funny how I didn't chalk it up as courage back then. But that had to take a lot of courage. It had all the elements of courage because I also was thinking about the Nike ad too. Because I remember when the Nike ad went out, I just loved it when they say, just do it. Just do it. And I always heard the Nike ad. I'm like, okay, just do it. So that became my motto of just doing it. So I didn't have to worry about all the doubts and stuff. But anyways, that's a short story.
It's so funny that you heard the Nike ad as, it sounds like a drill sergeant. Just do it. Where I remember that ad and it was more encouraging. Like, just do it. Like you can do it.
Yeah. I heard it as just do it.
That's so funny. That's something.
I definitely,
Hysterical.
yeah, I get scared into action very easily. Yeah. That's yeah. So,
I want to focus this in. That's what I would call a situational courage. And the next time we come around to courage, we'll do situational courage. But this week, we're focusing on this concept of interpersonal courage because that's where most of us probably are experiencing the need to be in our courage on a regular basis. A lot of us can lead lives where we're not facing situational fears, so we don't have to
mm,
pull up that courage.
mhm.
But if you are married, if you're in a relationship, if you have children, which I don't have children, but I love the description is having a child is like watching your heart walk outside your body,
Wow,
which,
true,
parents every day that their
true.
child is out there and they have uncertainty, they have no power, no control, emotional exposure. Just being a parent every single day takes courage.
Yeah,
So maybe you're at work and
all the time, I
it's,
think.
yeah, you have teams or there's some interpersonal conflict. Anytime that you are dealing with other people, you will be seeing opportunities to engage in interpersonal courage. So let's sort of break that down and look at what that's about. How do we strengthen that? How do we become aware that we have these opportunities to practice courage? Karen, I'm going to ask you to start with this because the first thing we're going to talk about is something I know is really near and dear to your heart, which is authentic connection.
Yeah, I call them intentional, right? Intentional
Mhm.
slash authentic connections and the importance of that because oftentimes it's so easy to get away with just saying enough. Then you talk, but then there's this miscommunication that occurs. And I just wanted to focus on this importance of always being courageous and always being curious so that that way you can have more intentional and authentic connection. Because when we acknowledge our fears, and do the action anyways, we already show up authentically. And I
Mm.
think that's the best part of it because when you're authentic, then they'll want to be authentic because it invites someone in because they can feel it because it comes from your heart. Because when you're surgical, you don't feel that emotion. When I say surgical, I mean is you say it very quickly, but you don't make a connection with the person. And courage sometimes is you need to say what you feel and you're not as afraid about what to think a person is going to respond before you say it. The importance of courage in authentic communication is to realize you need to share how you think and then be open to what their response is, knowing that you have the tools and everything to respond to that.
I would imagine that with leaders and the environment you work in, that it would be really empowering to have these courageous conversations. Can you speak a little bit to that?
So, with the relationships, I said when you start to learn to share and be courageous in sharing your perspective, what's cool about it is you start to feel empowered. I remember I shared with one of my coachees, she just didn't want to share things with their group. And I asked her why. And it was because of the fact that she was so scared because she was so new. We talked about sharing because it's a way for her to bring her value into the organization because she's being paid to share her perspective. I mean, she has this knowledge and everything, and she should just share it. And I think it's so funny how we are scared to share because you're so worried we're going to get fired or someone's going to think we're stupid or all these other things. And once you share once, this happened to her. Once she shared once, she felt empowered to share again. She took the fear and made it empowering. She didn't let it stop her. She found it as a way to actually get more excited about it. Like I'm learning something new. The reason why I bring this up is because with a lot of my clients, it's really understanding the importance of courage because it always coexists with fear because fear becomes actually empowering, right? So instead of tearing you down, it actually becomes empowering to the fact where you're doing things so that you make a difference, right? You're not waiting until you feel fearless to take those important actions in relationships because that's what we tend to do. We tend to wait until the right time, but then the right time is gone, right? Or you're like, oh, I wish I would have said it back then. The point is the fact that it's really important you take the important actions and step into courage. Because again, it can be liberating because we have to realize the importance of being scared and brave simultaneously is what's important here.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I could tell you that it was really in my, when I used to work in a clinic, there was a lot of fear in that clinic. The leadership was, I don't know, it's a bit of a bullying environment. And we would literally talk about like who has the target on their back. So there was a lot of
Right.
fear. And you saw the different behaviors where some people really shut down and they
Mm.
would like close their door and disengage and disengage and disengage. Or I remember having that feeling of, okay, yeah, it's scary, but I knew this connection between fear and courage. And I have a strong value around courage. I'm a Leo, okay? Being courageous is supposed to be one of our inherent traits that
Ah,
my self story is. So I would be like, okay, I don't know what's going to happen today, but okay, I get to experience courage day. Instead of being, oh, I'm
wow.
going to be at that
Wow.
office and have a target on my back and be scared, I would frame it as I'm going to have an opportunity to experience courage today. So I think this idea that understanding that courage coexists with fear, that in itself can be empowering because this is why I say to clients, it is your invitation to become familiar with the courageous part of yourself.
Yeah.
So it's really tied to growth and learning. So the presence of fear often signals that we are going outside our comfort zone, right? I mean, if we were in our comfort zone, we would not be feeling fear. So the fact that we're feeling fear, one reason might be like your client who was new and it was maybe outside her comfort zone to be throwing her ideas in there already. You coached her to go outside her comfort zone. And as a therapist, that's where we talk about the growth zone. So the growth zone is just outside your comfort zone. Now, if you go way too far where you basically override your ability to cope, then you enter the trauma zone. But
Mm.
between the trauma zone and the comfort zone, that's the entire range of growth potential. So recognizing fear and then looking at it as an invitation to courage, especially in all these different relationships. And, we're talking about the work environment, but it's also in our personal relationships. And it might be having a conversation with a loved one about what our needs really are, and everything you talked about on the diving board
Mhm.
is the opportunity to stop for that moment and say, I'm going to go for it. And then that pride that you felt afterwards, you learned, right? Karen, would you say that you learned after that first time off the high dive that you could go off the high dive,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
So,
and I also had made a mountain out of a molehill. That was the thing that I was learning.
well, yeah, that in itself is also learning
It was a
because
big
maybe
learning, yeah, yeah,
next
yeah,
time you find
yeah.
yourself making a mountain out of molehill, you'll be like, well, is this like when I was afraid to go off the high dive? Right? We start building that experience base to start challenging our initial reaction to fear. Like you said earlier, there's a reason we have a fear response, but it doesn't mean we should just be an autopilot around fear. We want to learn to notice it and then question it. Is this really something to be scared of? And if it is, it's like, yeah, I should be scared. And then what Roosevelt said, but is something else worth doing anyway? We still act anyways. And
Mhm.
then we go and find courage. That's where we have the opportunity to encounter the courage that we have within us. And so when we do that, we're actually modeling healthy behaviors for others because when we demonstrate like we can take action even though we're scared instead of presenting a mask or being reactive instead or shutting down. When we can be in that present moment and be honest and say, I am scared. Like I'm a rock climber and
Mm.
I would be like, that looks terrifying. Like I noticed around me that wasn't common. The
To say
culture,
that, to
no,
say it,
no.
right?
They would say, oh, that looks rad, or I have no idea if that's why I think I came to a community that's more like fearlessness, like, "Oh, that looks rad," and a lot of times I'll say I'm like, first things out of my mouth is, "That looks terrifying," and then I'm like, "Okay, I'm scared," and, keep a tight rope on me because I'm going to need you. Karen, I don't know if I told you this, but I took a course called the Rock Warriors Way. It's the falling and commitment, and the Rock Warrior Way, Arno Ilner. It's a book and it's basically on confronting fear.
Oh,
And so
interesting.
this course was about falling. So
Oh.
you just fell, you took
Yeah.
lead falls, you fell and fell and fell. You couldn't wait for that perfect hold. He'd be like, climb, climb. And of course you'd miss a hold and fall. And you just kept falling and falling and falling till it became just part of the experience. And he even said part of your warm up should be taking falls. You have to take
Interesting.
the thing that looks scary, that's inflated, and start bringing it closer into your comfort zone. Oh, this is my warm up. Falling is part of my warm up. And I really recommend this book to people because it really goes into the ego and how the ego is the main thing that gets in our way of finding our courage, because it tells a story. Oh, people will laugh at you. They're going to think you suck. Whatever your story is. Oh, you have to do it perfectly. That the ego is really what gets in the way from your instinct and that feeling of this is something worth doing. And so when you're able to be comfortable talking about your fear, you really are role modeling for whether you're in a business world, whether it's for your children, whether it's, anywhere in your life. When you are able to say, I choose to do this really intentionally, it really affects really all the people around you in a positive way.
Yeah, I think at the work level that I share with a lot of leaders, the importance of when you're scared, leaders feel like they have to say, we can do it, we can do it. But sometimes it's really important that they actually say, guys, I know this is scary because I'm scared too. And when you say that, it makes you feel like you're one of them.
Do you see that should probably help build trust?
Oh yeah, it builds trust and it makes you feel like you're not way above them sitting on the ivory tower, not knowing what's going on. You're saying, and I think those are when you find those leaders that people love because they share those words of common words of what they're feeling. Like I know it's scary because I'm scared too, and how powerful that is.
Well, let's kind of go on into some other just common scenarios, because we've talked a lot about the business world, but I wanted to make sure we touched on other situations that are interpersonal in nature. So situations that require interpersonal courage could be something as simple as having a difficult conversation with your spouse, having a difficult conversation about finances, or having a conversation with family members about end of life care. And there's a lot of guilt involved. There's a lot of fear of being seen as uncaring. And so that could require that interpersonal courage, being vulnerable in a relationship, being in a situation like, oh, do I share how I'm really feeling? Am I the first one to say I love you? Or do I wait? Do I risk being rejected? It might be like today we see a need for interpersonal courage in the sense of speaking truth to power. Like I think people would agree that we're right now observing politicians across the spectrum who I think most of us would say have no courage and are pretty cynical and seem to only care about preserving their power, preserving their job, and are not willing to do things they say behind closed doors. They'll admit, oh, I don't think this is good, but then out in the open, they don't act on it. They respond instead to their fear, and they do something they don't even believe in. All of that is interpersonal courage. Admitting mistakes, that's a huge one in interpersonal. The ability to say, I'm wrong. This is a big one. Setting boundaries. I think one of the number one things that prevents people from setting boundaries is fear. Fear of making someone upset, fear of being seen as pushy, fear of being seen as needy, like fear. So I don't know if people ever thought about the boundaries this way, but you can even look at your boundaries practice as also a courage practice, as an opportunity to get in touch with that courageous part of you, because it's rare that until you get really good at it, where boundaries then become less scary in the beginning, there's always some degree of fear when you're first learning to establish boundaries.
And I think what you said earlier is interesting because I think it's like when I recognize I did little steps of courage, it makes it easier, right, to do a bigger step and bigger step. Let's talk a little bit also about the barriers. So what do you think? You mentioned like the fear of rejection, right? And what are some of the other fears that you talk about?
Sometimes past experience where we had fear combined with powerlessness. So we had fear, but not the ability to act. That can end up becoming the frame in which we view all experiences of fear. Even though maybe in today the situation is different or that relationship is different. You see this a lot with people who have trauma from their childhood, is now they're adults and they're in these new relationships, but the fears of the child when they were powerless are showing up. And so some of the work is to help them recognize that they're bringing that frame and to be in the present to say, this is your partner, or this is your, your spouse. And it's important, like, this isn't the past, this is the right now. So that could get in the way until there's that connection that, I'm an adult now, I'm actually not going to be abandoned. And then they can still get an opportunity to feel courage, because that flavor of fear, that tinge of fear is still going to be there. What I said earlier, these self-limiting beliefs that I'm not a courageous person, but what they're really thinking is I'm not fearless. Everybody has fear. So if everybody has fear, we all have the opportunity to find the courage within us. We may not have practiced it because we told ourselves, I'm not fearless, and we were waiting for fearlessness. But the lack of understanding that differentiation might be getting in the way. We've had episodes on people having avoidance strategies. When we avoidance is a very self-reinforcing strategy, because when I avoid, I don't experience the adverse thing. That's good. So I continue to avoid. So avoidance will definitely get in the way of being able to be present to the fear, and then instead of avoiding, moving towards choosing to act anyway. And then finally, if you haven't cultivated some risk tolerance and comfort with vulnerability, and this goes back to what Brené Brown found in her research, that anytime you will be encountering the need for courage, you will have uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Well, the uncertainty part, that just comes with life, but our ability to tolerate risk and our ability to be strong in the face of that emotional exposure, that's something we can cultivate by strengthening our comfort with vulnerability. And like we talked last week, learning to sit with that uncertainty and finding, maybe more something deeper, that existential, deeper meaning within. So I'm going to put a link in the show notes to what I recommend to clients. If you're not familiar with Brené Brown, or maybe you've read her books, but she has an audio called The Power of Vulnerability. And the whole thing is about 6 hours. So it's not in a book. And she goes through the behaviors that get in the way we protect ourselves. But then she goes into these 10, I think she calls them the 10 mileposts of the wholehearted. But there are 10 practices that people who have comfort with vulnerability engage in. And I will put that in the show notes, because if you want to do this work, that's an important thing to have in your toolkit.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I just really love her. And I remember one of the things she said about vulnerability was about when she was doing the sign language for vulnerability, right? And there's a sign language where it was like weak in the knees. And then she goes, no, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. And I did another one, which is like this, which is like open up yourselves and show yourself, your true self. I just love that powerful, because that's what the courage is too. You expose your fear in a way that it becomes, you just do it anyways because you expose your fear. And by exposing
your heart,
fear,
right?
you feel your
It's
heart.
like,
Yeah. Fear and heart. Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
So then how do we do that, right? That's a big question. Like,
Yeah.
okay, so you're listening to this and you're like, I want to
Okay.
be courageous. I want to find my courage. I want to get, reacquainted with it. How do we do that? Because there are definitely practices. One of the practices is challenge your identity story and go back and do that by listing all the acts of courage that you've already done. So like, if you're married, someone did the proposing. If you're the person who did the proposing, that was an act of courage. If you're the person who said yes, that was an act of courage. It's you making this lifelong commitment. Or asking someone out on a first date, that was an act of courage. That first day on the job, when you first went up to someone and introduced yourself. There's a lot of people who are not the natural social, like they don't, that's not you. If you're someone who's like, oh my God, a whole bunch of new people I get to say hi to, you don't have any fear. That's not one of those moments of courage. But if you're like me, who walked around with a lot of social anxiety, that was an act of courage to go introduce myself to somebody and to talk to someone. I mean, you can see how just ordinary it is. Or someone bumps into you at the grocery store, and the part of you that says, just ignore it and don't have a conflict is in conflict with the part of you that it says, F that. Like, hey, buddy, back up the cart. That's an act of courage. Even though that little bit of like, just don't start conflict because of fear of conflict, that's a little act of courage. So I really want you to go back, challenge the identity story that says, I'm not courageous. And like Karen did, go back and see all these little acts of courage. It helps to bring awareness to what your fear triggers are. What are the things that create fear? Because all of those are opportunities to connect with courage. And I think, Karen, you said this earlier, start small. Little acts of courage, exercise the courage muscle. Start with people you feel safe with, that you don't have the giant risk of losing a job or something like that. Learn to breathe is really important, because when we have the fear, we tend to clench up a bit and we can get shallow in our breathing. And that can cause our brain to actually shut down a little bit. And then we can't go into that principled, valued-based thinking about, oh, here's an opportunity for me to connect with my values around courage. We need our brain to work for us to be able to do that. So you have to be breathing and getting that oxygen to your brain. Fear always can trigger that constriction in your heart and lungs. So recognizing your fear triggers and then learning to breathe. I mean, it's simple stuff, but it's really important. When I'm scared, I always take a deep breath before I do something now. And I think climbing really helped me with that. And then we really invite you to revisit the episode on sitting with uncertainty, since that's one of the variables. Notice where courage lives in your body. Karen, where do you feel courage?
In my
In
heart.
your heart?
Yeah, in my heart. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like it's in my heart because it stems from somewhere where it's like we were saying earlier, why do I want to do it? And because I so want to do it, it's like it expands because so that's why I think it comes from my heart. That's what I was saying. What about you? Where does it come for courage come from you?
Yeah,
Definitely not from the brain. I know that for me. That's
well,
sorry, I just had to bring
it does come from the heart, because I now have this practice of always connecting the experience of fear. So fear is something that's more a sensation. Our heart starts racing, our perspective starts to narrow, we feel sweaty in our palms, we might feel adrenaline and nervousness. So fear is actually a physiological response. I've trained myself now that whenever that array of symptoms happens, to think, oh, I have an opportunity to experience courage.
Yeah, which is
I have that.
amazing. It's
Yeah,
amazing that you've trained yourself because I'm not at that point yet. So that's amazing.
yeah, but it doesn't mean I'm always. I mean, there's some. It's like, let me see if this is an opportunity, or is this a accurate fear signal, and I need to get the heck out of here. So, but my first thing isn't shut down now. My first thing is
Yeah.
like curiosity. Is this an opportunity for me to connect with courage, because I have such strong values around it? But get this. So I did a trauma training, a year-long program called Somatic Experiencing. And one of the things I found was that I also feel courage. Like, I had on these A solo hiking boots when I was in the class. Okay. Each boot is like 1.5 pounds.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
You could
they're
kick a door
leather, they
down. Could
last.
you like kick a door down with that?
You can't kick a door out, but you can tromp through water in them. They
Oh, okay.
last
All right.
decades. These shoes are like, and there was something about, I felt that when I had those boots on, I also felt the courage in my feet, like the
Oh,
weight of it. I felt
interesting.
super grounded. And then the other spot was like the top of, like, just about 2 inches above my knees. I cannot tell you why.
That's so funny. Yeah.
But not only was it courage, it was like the happy warrior. It was a
Yeah.
warrior that was laughing. I was like, "What?" So this is why I want people to scan your body,
Yeah.
because, yeah, you might feel it from your heart, but who knows where else you happen to feel courage. I didn't know I'd find a happy warrior 2 inches above my knees. I don't even understand what that's about. But it's there, and if anything's scary, and I don't have my boots on, I could also tap that area. Like I will get connected and I'll rub that part. And it's kind of like this way of sitting, leaning forward. I'll put my
Interesting.
hands on there and then lean forward. Like I'm listening, I'm here, I'm present, I'm in, and it connects me to that courage in my body. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. And one of the things that I do that helps me a lot is when I get nervous, like I'm going to be doing a lot of training soon, right? Internal kind, brand new stuff. So I've been putting on every single day music. One song I know, just remember to remind me of the gifts that I have. It's simply me. But what I like about it is it's about that music that reminds me again and grounds me to be courageous because I just got to show up. And the more I realize with the courage, it's about showing up as I am, like we were saying earlier, authentically. It just makes it easier for some reason. It doesn't make that scary monster, that fear so big. And just to begin to trust myself. So I love music. I know some people use characters or, I know Tony Robbins says about the warrior in you, or so allows you to be courageous, because you bring out these other people in you. Or I guess even sports heroes I've heard too.
Yeah, and I think you meant movie characters.
Oh, that's what I meant. Sorry.
Yeah. So this is going to say something about my personality, but if anybody saw the movie Wednesday, I guess it's based on the Addams
Oh,
family and the daughter.
I would never have thought about Wednesday. You're
I
right.
think it's a Netflix series. I think
Yeah.
it's on Netflix.
Yeah.
And she just ends up like there's this mystery, and I don't know, as an autistic part of me that kind of relates to her, but there's just like she's so unfazed, but there's all this scary monster that's out there and killing people, and there is something the way that she
Deals
shows
with it.
courage. I resonate with it,
Oh,
so it might be
interesting.
anybody else's. So sometimes if it's a scary situation, it's like, what would Wednesday do? That's how
That's
I use
interesting.
character. Would Wed and I'll feel it, Oh,
Yeah. Oh,
she's
that's interesting.
if you always look, she always thinks everything is curious and interesting.
I'll
So I
have to
think
I
that's why.
never saw her that way, so I'll have to go look at her that way. I
Oh,
think of her as she just scares the living daylights out of me, so I
oh,
never watch her. So
her, she's one of my
so because we're close to time, what I would really like to ask you to consider to do one courageous act this week, whether it be a
Ooh.
spouse or somebody at work or someone. And I'd love to hear what it is and how it went. We'd love to hear what it is in the comments on YouTube or through email. And the key thing that we want to take away is courage is about taking meaningful action despite fear, right?
Yes.
And small courageous actions count, even the ones when you're running off the diving board. Remember that. Because a lot of us already have a lot of past courage examples. I know when I thought about that, now I have tons and I can't wait to write them down more and more. It's really cool. It's really cool.
Just looking around at your relationships, since this
Yeah.
has been focusing on interpersonal relationships and courage in those relationships, and think about especially maybe your closest relationships. Because in some ways, if that relationship is meaningful, isn't it deserve for you to show up as your most courageous self? So I'll leave you with that to think about. And so we hope to see you next week. And until then, remember everybody, be curious and be kind. And we will see you next week. Bye,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.